everybody. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this live stream with Blenheim Palace. What a treat. My name's Dan Snow here, and I am extremely excited working with Blenheim. Again, can't get enough of the place. Love going there, and I've working with them digitally, and it's great to see so many of you on this live stream as well. We've got a very special author, family member, person on the live stream this time, because I've got Michael Waterhouse, the grandson of the 10th Duke, and he is a direct descendant of the first Duke, who died today 299 years ago, the Duke of Marlborough. Michael is going to tell us about his own recollections living at Blenheim as a child, being at Blenheim as a child, but also what he's learned about the great man, the first Duke, over a lifetime of research. Michael has written various books and done a ton of research. Perhaps the most famous one is Edwardian Requiem, a life of Sir Edward Grey. It's a fascinating, pivotal figure in early 20th century British history. And I think it's just great to have him here to ask him about his recollections of the palace and what he thinks the first Duke means in that family story. Michael, how are you doing?
Hi Dan, I'm fine. Great to see you. We're waiting for the thunderstorms here in London, so if we get interrupted, the windows are wide open. We'll have some good background music.
Yes, it's very Shakespearean. It's like King Lear. When you were a child and you were at Blenheim, and this was it was family home for you. It must have been a place of laughter and fun. At what stage did you start to look around you and think, crikey, this is not normal. My other friends at school do not have this, and start thinking about the man who laid the foundations for the whole thing, who created it?
Well, I had a very formidable Aberdonian nanny called Miss Grassick, who came down to Blenheim in the 30s with my grandparents when they inherited the dukedom. And Nanny Grassick, as we called her, looked after my mum and then me. And she used to take me for walks, and we used to go out across the Banbury's wonderful bridge up to the Column of Victory. And that's otherwise known as the Monument. And on the Column of Victory at the top is the great Captain General, Queen Anne's Captain General, our great hero of this talk. And he sits there adorned as a conquering Roman general, perched up there looking south towards his palace. And so that was really the first thing that made me think, we've got somebody special here. And I know something about his profession. He must have been a great soldier. And just in front of the palace, when you go over the bridge, there's in front of the main entrance, in the Great Court, there are two captured French cannon. And we always used to come back from the Column of Victory, and with my cousins, we always used to play on these cannon. So it was the Column of Victory, and it was the cannon outside. And then inside the palace, funnily enough, it was one of the tapestries. Now, Blenheim's famous for its tapestries. They were commissioned by the first Duke in the first decade of the 18th century in Brussels. And some are general, Art of War series they're called, and some are specific, like the one we're looking at now. That's, I think, the first Duke taking Talar's surrender at Blenheim. But there was one particular tapestry that I'll never forget, and it was in the private dining room, and that's called the bow window room, and it's the room where Duchess Sarah, when they moved into the house in 1719, used to love to sit, and my granny had it as the private dining room. Anyway, depicted a very gory scene. But first of all, I want to tell you briefly about Granny's chef. She had this amazing chef that did a icing sugar model of Blenheim Palace, and it now, window for window, door for door, it's huge, it's quite incredible, and it sits in a glass cabinet now off the Great Hall. And apart from doing that, he did some quite modest things, like there's a particular starter at lunch that I loved, and that was a creamy baked egg lodged in a baked potato. And I always remember trying to tuck into my favorite earth-on baked potato, looking at this tapestry. And there in front of me was an English dragoon with his head split open by a cutlass or something, with blood pouring out, and his trusty steed next door on all fours, and he'd been shot in the chest, the horse. And so there's all this blood and gore, and in the middle was a corporal of the horse wrestling a French standard with fleur-de-lis away from a French cavalryman. But it always used to take the shine off my baked egg looking at these gory scenes. So it was the tapestries, the cannon, the column of victory, and they made me aware that here was somebody very special, and he must have been quite a soldier.
And within the family, was there talk of this kind of patriarchal figure? Of course, his wonderful wife Sarah. Like, did people say, oh, you know, we all owe our station in life to this man, John Churchill? I mean, were you taught to sort of celebrate him and learn about him?
You know, not really, and that's what's so wonderful about what Blenheim was doing for his 300th anniversary of his death, because the brand, of course, has gone to Winston Churchill. And it has been for a very long time. And everybody sort of tended to talk about Winston. He was born there, you know, he was the Churchill that everybody knew. So no, there wasn't he was rather taken for granted. You know, here was this enormous palace. Honestly, the royal family have nothing like Blenheim. It's the second largest building after Wentworth Woodhouse in the country. There's no palace like it. It's extraordinary, but everybody had rather forgotten about Marlborough. But it was just, you know, me. I was an inquisitive young man. I was very proud that I was a member of the Churchill family. I loved Blenheim. And it was things like, as I said, the tapestry, the cannon, you know, that I realized that he was a great soldier. But no, he's been largely forgotten. And that's what's so wonderful about the next year. We're going to learn a lot more about this great man. He turned out to be one of the most influential public servants this country's ever produced, and arguably our greatest general.
Right, well, let's hear from one of his descendants, Michael. Tell us who he was. He had such a fascinating, turbulent, particularly the early part of his life. Was he born into sort of greatness? Was his destiny set for him since birth?
No. Basically, he was born in 1650. He was born in very turbulent times, 5 years after the end of the Civil War, and he came from a modest but genteel background. He was the son of an impoverished West Country squire who'd been set back in the Civil War. He was called Winston Churchill, believe it or not, his father, and he was a storybook cavalier. You know, he fought his whole way for his king through the Civil War. He was a captain of the horse. He fought with great courage at the Battle of Roundaway Down in 1643. But like so many of his royalist friends, he was on the losing side. And at the end of the war, he was penalized by Parliament, by the parliamentarians. And in 1649, he was fined at today's rates £200,000. Now, his estate near Sherborne was purchased by his father, and it's quite small. It gave £160 a year. That would be, say, £16,000 a year now. So he probably had to mortgage that to pay the fine. So, you know, he had a very tough time. And he, after the war, when Churchill was a baby, John Churchill was a baby, he had to go and live with his mother-in-law, Lady Drake, near Axminster. Which was quite nearby, because he just couldn't afford to run his own house. And two interesting things come out of that. Firstly, his mother-in-law, Lady Drake, had a sister who was married to an Earl of Marlborough. And the husband died, the Earl of Marlborough died quite young, and the title died with it. So this would be the title that John Churchill would take when he was ennobled in 1689 by William of Orange, following the Glorious Revolution. That's interesting in itself. And the second thing is that Winston's father, our John's grandfather, married a Miss Winston, who was the daughter of a Gloucestershire knight. And that's how the Christian name Winston comes into the family. So those are two quite interesting little pointers. But it wasn't until the Restoration in 1660 that the Churchill family's prospects started to get brighter. And if I can just tell you for a second about Winston, he became MP for Weymouth, and he went to Ireland in 1662. He got a very nice sort of civil service plum job to be coroner of the claims court, the land claims courts in Dublin. So he took his family over to Dublin. We know very little about John Churchill's early life. He just lived with his grandmother, Lady Drake. But he went to Ireland for those 2 years with his father. His father got a salary for doing the job. And we know he had a clergyman tutor at home. But they came back in late 1664, and Winston was knighted, which was wonderful because he was true to his king, Charles I, in the war. He'd been MP for Weymouth. He had done a good job in Ireland, civil service. So he got knighted, but he didn't get any money back. He had his estate, but no money. But the key thing was the patronage he had from a fellow called Lord Arlington. Lord Arlington was a friend of King Charles II. He was actually one of his ministers. He was a great friend of the Duke of York's. And in those days, it wasn't what you know, it was who you knew. And that's still true today to a much lesser extent. But Lord Arlington got him the job in Ireland, Winston. They were at Oxford together. They were undergraduates together. So great friends. He got him the job in Ireland. And most importantly of all, which launched John Churchill's career, he got two of the children, Winston's children, jobs at court. If I can just mention Arabella, because she's very important. That's John Churchill's sister. Arabella in 1665 went to court, and she was a maid of honor to the Duchess of York. Being a maid of honor meant you were a paid companion, basically. You had to be pretty, you had to be intelligent. So what happened? She was very pretty. She was apparently out riding one day, out hunting with the Duke of York's entourage, and she fell off her horse. And her petticoats were up round her neck, and the Duke of York noticed that she had a particularly curvaceous figure, and within weeks she was his mistress. And Arabella, in the end, bore 4 children to the future James II, the Duke of York, including a fellow called the Duke of Berwick, who was obviously Churchill's nephew, and Churchill in 1690 would fight him in Ireland. So very interesting. Arabella gets to step up into court, 1665. In 1666, she's followed by our hero, John Churchill. He's only 16 years old, and he goes in as a page to the Duke of York. And he's a remarkable young man. Sarah said, his wife said of him, that he was as beautiful as an angel. I mean, he was very, very good looking. He had very good teeth, quite extraordinary in those days. He had a rosy complexion. He had a leg for a boot. He was very handsome. He had terrific manners, and he had great charm. So all the attributes to make a great courtier. So he went to court in 1666 at the age of 16. The next year, in 1667, he purchased his commission. He became an ensign in the Foot Guards. Then he did 2 years apprenticeship in the army, if you like, at Tangier with the Foot Guards fighting the Barbary pirates, came back to court, and here's another very important time, in 1670. And he got picked up, if you like, by a notorious lady who was Charles II's favorite mistress, Barbara Castlemaine, Duchess of Cleveland. And she was quite a bit older, and she really fell for this handsome young guy. And they actually had a child together, an illegitimate child, I think in 1672, a daughter, which Charles II wasn't at all pleased about, actually. And he in turn, he was quite pleased when he was packed off to the Dutch wars in 1672. There's a great story about Charles II, Old Rowley as he was named, he had so many girlfriends, coming along to the Barbara's boudoir, knocking on the door, and our great hero is making passionate love to Barbara. And Barbara says, out the window, and he slides down the drain pipe into the courtyard to avoid the embarrassment of being caught with the king's mistress. And in her gratitude, she gifts John £5,000. And this is a huge amount of money in those days. That's 500,000 quid. And he buys an annuity of £500 a year. So here we have this really handsome young man at court in his early 20s. He's an ensign in the Foot Guards. He's got financial security with the annuity. He's at court. He's much liked. He's got liftoff. He's got his first foot on the slippery slope of the ladder, which is so important in his career. And so that's basically the story of how he gets a leg up at court. It's very little we know about his childhood when he lived with his grandmother. It's only 16 onwards that we really start learning about him.
But it turns out he was a very good soldier. I mean, so he had luck, and he might have, used his handsomeness to get into the right position. But once he was a soldier, he turned out he was very good at it.
He was arguably, as I said, the greatest general that our country's produced. He was indeed a brilliant soldier, and it was in the 1670s when I said he was packed off to the Dutch wars in 1672. Charles was delighted because he'd nicked his favourite mistress. It's in those wars, 1672, 1675, and it's fascinating because Marlborough's fighting with the French against the Dutch. French would be his future enemies, the Dutch his allies, but he's fighting with the French because of Charles II's signed the secret Treaty of Dover. He's dissolved Parliament. He's living with subsidies from Louis XIV. Charles II is a clever old dude. But anyway, it was in these Dutch wars that Marlborough really learned the art of warfare, because he was fighting under two brilliant French generals, Turenne, who was in charge of the overall French army, who was a master of two things that Marlborough became famous for: mobility and maneuver. And Napoleon spent hours studying Marlborough's campaigns because of his maneuver and mobility. Napoleon put it into action in his Italian campaigns in the 1790s. But so it was firstly Turenne, and the other one was called Vauban. And Vauban was a great engineer. And siege warfare was very important in these times. And Marlborough, conducted maybe 40 or 50 sieges in his lifetime. And he learned a huge amount from Vauban. So he learned, under the tutelage of these two French generals, he learned an enormous amount. But he was only a captain. He was promoted to a captain at the Battle of Southwold Bay. And in 1673, at the Siege of Maastricht, funnily enough, he saved the life of the Duke of Monmouth, who was Charles II's bastard son. So that put him back in favour with Charles. Fell out of favour because he nicked his mistress, back in favour because he saved the life of his son. So the 1670s was very much a period of apprenticeship, and under the tutelage of these two French generals.
They would regret teaching him as well as they did, because Churchill navigated the downfall of James II, Charles II's younger brother, and ended up on the right side of history, as it were, didn't he? With William, Mary, and Anne. How did he rise to high command?
Well, it's a long story, but what happened is that you're quite right that he did desert his colours, so to speak, in 1668 at the Glorious Revolution. What happened in 1685? Charles II died. So he'd done his apprenticeship under Charles II, and he'd actually, in 1678, he was a full colonel of the English regiment fighting for the French. So apprenticeship then. Then comes 1685, when Charles dies, the Duke of Monmouth invades, as a Protestant, invades England with a bunch of rebels. And Marlborough is second in command of the English army. He's in charge of the cavalry. And Marlborough could have defected and gone to, and left James II, but he didn't, because he knew that Monmouth's army was a motley collection of people. It wasn't well supplied, it wasn't supported from the continent. And Marlborough took on behalf of James, Monmouth's army at the Battle of Sedgemoor in 1685. He was second in command, the Earl of Feversham was in command, but he was asleep when the rebels attacked. Marlborough was in charge of the cavalry, marshalled all the troops, and he was basically responsible for the victory. So that really gave him a leg up. And after that, he was made Baron Churchill of Sandridge, and he was given command of several regiments. Then, after that, there was the bloody assizes with Judge Jeffreys, when all the rebels were sent to Australia or hung, drawn, and quartered. It was horrible. All the peasants in the West Country really got treated incredibly badly. And James increasingly tried to stamp Catholicism on a Protestant country. And, you know, things like the magistrates, the Lord Lieutenants, the university dons, the army, he stuffed them full of Catholics. They became more and more unpopular. So then in 1688, the great Whig grandees like Lord Shrewsbury, the Duke of Devonshire, wrote to William of Orange and said, listen, it's time you came over and got rid of James. And the amazing thing that Churchill did, he deserted his colours. He went from James to William of Orange. But by doing that, he went over with maybe a couple of troops of life guards or horse guards, but he was the most respected, the most liked, the most admired, successful soldier in the British Army. So the whole British Army followed Marlborough. So he facilitated the Glorious Revolution. It was a bloodless revolution. I mean, if he hadn't, we could have had a revolution 100 years later, like France, you know, very bloody. So that was very important to him. After that, he was made, because of he facilitated the bloodless revolution, he was made the Earl of Marlborough, and he became, you know, he was promoted again and again. But then he went downhill. In 1692, he went to the Tower. William came over, living in terribly turbulent times here. And William started promoting his Dutch favourites over the top of Marlborough and Ptolemaish, who two great English generals. He started stuffing the House of Lords with his Dutch favourites. And Marlborough complained about that, so was seen as a bit of a loose cannon by William. But also William never really trusted Marlborough because he deserted James II, so he thought he could, you know, he'd do the same to him. Marlborough was implicated falsely in a Jacobite plot, you know, to bring back James II, and he was sent to the Tower only for 6 weeks because it was all fictitious. But he had a very tricky time in the 1690s under William, because he didn't really trust him. And it was really later under Queen Anne that he came into his own in 1702, when he became, you know, this is a whole other story, Captain General of the British Army, Master of the Ordnance, Knight of the Garter. Queen Anne gave him the lot. But he had a very, very rough time under Charles II, James II, William, even under Anne, huge politics going on. And all I can say is how he survived the stress, I do not know. And I have a bad enough tummy at times for stress. How he survived the stress and got through it. He had very bad headaches and things like that. And actually, you've got to think that when he at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704 was in the saddle, you know, he was 54 years old. I mean, so that was quite an age for these days. So it was a long apprenticeship, 1680s, Sedgemoor, Glorious Revolution played an important role, 1690s, setbacks with William, and then boof, Wars of the Spanish Succession, 1701, he came into his own and, you know, became the greatest soldier we've ever produced. Remarkable man.
Do you think his wife helped him with that stress? I mean, was she the rock?
Oh my goodness gracious, she certainly was at the beginning, Sarah. There's no doubt about it. She became Lady of the Bedchamber to Princess Anne, who became Queen Anne in 1683. And they literally hammered their flag to Princess Anne's cause. They were known as the Cockpit, the group, you know, around Princess Anne. That was a little bit of Whitehall. And Sarah had a hell of a relationship with, you've probably seen the film The Favourite, with Queen Anne. How intimate it was, we don't know. But some of the letters from Queen Anne to Sarah in the 1680s demonstrate unrequited love, the dejected lover. But they had a very close relationship, John and Sarah. So I can't believe she did have an ultra intimate relationship with the Queen. But who knows? You know, we're going up the greasy pole here. We've got ambitious people. To get to the top of the greasy pole, you have the patronage of the monarch. And so you never quite know. But she was terribly important to Marlborough in the early stages of his career, with her relationship with Queen Anne. And that was transferred by the Queen to Marlborough. She became a flipping liability later on. I mean, you know, ironically, just before Marlborough reached his peak in 1704 and 1703, You know, she was incredibly rude to the Queen, very disrespectful. They argued like mad. She was a very difficult personality, Sarah, and the relationship was on the slide. So I would say she was on the up and a great favourite from 1683 through to 1703, and really helped Marlborough. And thereafter, she was actually a flipping hindrance to Marlborough, because once you lost the patronage of Queen Anne, and she was Queen, remember, from 1702, you were in trouble. 1703 was the key year because Sarah and Marlborough lost their son, Jack. He was their only son. They'd had one die in childbirth or early in his youth. And he was at King's College, Cambridge. He got smallpox. And it absolutely broke them because they were thinking of establishing a dynasty, you know. He was made a duke in 1702 by Queen Anne before he'd fought any of his battles, which created a lot of jealousy. But 1703, Sarah went downhill. The loss of her son, menopause was probably coming on, making her difficult. And she started being incredibly rude, disrespectful to Queen Anne. And then the other favourite, Abigail Marsham, came up. And then she really started being a hindrance to Marlborough. But she was a remarkable woman. She had a famous temper. She was incredibly litigious. She was always taking architects and builders to court. She argued with everybody. She never spoke to her daughters, and the daughters didn't speak to her, Henrietta and Mary. She was a tricky lady, but she was commercially very astute, and she was a very loyal wife to Marlborough. They always said they had a passionate love affair. And the great thing they always said was that Marlborough never waited to take his boots off to make love to her when he came back from his campaigns. So there was this great love affair, but across a big political divide. You know, Sarah was a Whig, he was a Tory. Sarah's family had been parliamentarians. Sarah's father supported John Pym, great parliamentarian. Marlborough was born an instinctive Tory. So they were very different, but it was a great love affair. And all in all, it was a very successful marriage, but she was a tricky lady.
We've got Blenheim Palace named after the Battle of Blenheim. Just briefly tell us why Blenheim was such an important battle.
Okay, well, if you think about it, it's the first time that the Sun King, Louis XIV, had been given a bloody nose. I mean, it's the first comprehensive defeat of the French, probably since Agincourt in 1415. So Marlborough at Blenheim breaks, you know, many years of French hegemony over Europe. He puts a stop to the expansionist ambitions of Louis XIV in Europe. This was the first major battle he won in 1704. So that's very important. He puts a halt to Louis XIV's ambitions. Let me just say what else happened. Blenheim was fought in the Danube Valley. It was fought in South Germany. It was fought in Bavaria. So what he did is he saved Vienna. The great alliance here was, it's always the balance of power, you know, in our history. You side with the weakest against the strongest being France. And the greatest alliance here was Austro-Hungarian Empire based in Vienna, the Dutch, us, the Hanoverians, the Germans, the Danes, etc. But the French, along with the Elector of Bavaria, that German state was Catholic, so they sided with Louis XIV. They decided to threaten Vienna. And so Marlborough in 1704 had to march an army down from the Dutch-German border down to the Danube. It was an incredible, experience, the whole thing. It was 250 miles, and he did it in May, in 2 months or something, down the Rhine, down through the Jura forest, into Bavaria. And by beating the French down there with the Elector of Bavaria, the French and the Bavarians, he saved Vienna. And if Vienna had been taken then, you know, it would have all been over. Austria would have been conquered, and the alliance, the Great Alliance, would have fallen. So Blenheim was very important. But it wasn't just Blenheim. There were another, that was 1704, there were another It ended in the last campaign, Marlborough's campaign was 1711. So there were another 7 years of war. And the French had 8 armies. It's quite extraordinary how much manpower they had. They had 8 armies. And what Marlborough managed to do over the next 7 or 8 years is really weaken France, okay? France had no centralized way of funding wars. We had a Bank of England established in 1690. We issued gilts, war loan. We could fund our wars. It was jolly difficult at home because the Tories were against the war. That's another matter with all the politics. But he weakened France to such an extent that 50 years later, when came the 7 Years' War, when the British Empire took off, you know, with Wolfe at Quebec and Clyde in India, we absolutely smashed a weakened France, and the empire took off. So what I say about Marlborough is he didn't just win Blenheim in his battles, but he laid the foundations for the British Empire. He laid the foundations for smashing France, weakening France, laying the foundations of the British Empire and sort of Georgian glory. So Blenheim was a very important battle because it's the first time that Louis XIV had his nose bloodied. But there are other battles. Ramillies was an even more comprehensive defeat of the French in 1706, brilliantly conceived by Marlborough. Then there was Oudenarde in 1708. And the last major battle was Malplaquet in 1709. Actually there we lost more troops than the French, but we drove them from the battlefield. And anyway, the great thing about Marlborough is his record. He never lost a battle, and there was no siege of any fortress, any town, any city that he failed to take. Nobody has a record like that. And I always remember at prep school being told by my history master, he always used to say, "What's Marlborough's telephone number?" And we always used to say, "Brom 4689. Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet, 1704, 1706, 1709. So his record speaks for itself. I mean, Wellington's was a very good record too, although he lost, interestingly, some sieges he got into trouble with. In Siege of Burgos in the Peninsular War in 1812, he got a bloody nose there. Wellington was a defensive general, Marlborough was offensive general. But he was a genius, Marlborough. He really was. He was a military genius. But there's one other thing I should say. He was a man for all seasons. He wasn't just a general. He was a great administrator. He was a great diplomat. He was a great courtier. He was a great statesman. He was his own foreign secretary in a way. If you think of the analogy of 1944, when you had Eisenhower, Brooke, and Monty, he was all those 3 men wrapped into one. Not only did he execute strategy, but he determined it too. So, you know, because of communications and everything, he was out there. And he was a great coalition general. He had to keep this coalition together. When he wasn't campaigning from October to March, you know, in the winter months, he was traveling around the capitals of Europe, keeping the coalition together, going to see the Prussians, the Hanoverians, you know, going to Vienna. We want troops for next year. And how many cavalry are you going to give us? What sort of infantry? You know, where's the funding coming from? He did everything himself. That's what was so remarkable. And he was a very good, also, he was a good delegator, and he was very good at choosing his subordinate officers. They had some super loyal commanders underneath him. He was a remarkable man. It's difficult to tell you in a short time all about it. But,
well, I think you've made that very clear. And just let's finish. What was his legacy, architectural legacy at Blenheim Palace? Let's come back to the building.
Well, let me tell you about his legacy. Let me just run through the legacy because it's really important. We've agreed the legacy. Number one is that he stopped Louis XIV in his tracks. That was very important, laid the foundations of the British Empire. Number two, associated with that, I just want to say the British Army came into its own under Marlborough. Cromwell had started the professionalisation of the army with the new model army and the Ironsides. Marlborough pushed that through into reality, you know, particularly with the British infantry, came a really feared force with its firepower and everything. happening. So that was 2. 3, you've got to look at the Glorious Revolution we talked about briefly. When William came over, Marlborough facilitated it, okay? 2 things he facilitated. He saved the Protestant religion. William of Orange came over and kicked out the Catholic James. Secondly, most importantly of all, he established a constitutional monarchy, which meant, you know, the Whigs liked a monarchy that ruled through a strong parliament. William didn't mind about having his hands tied behind his back and being a constitutional monarch, because all he wanted was an ally to fight Louis XIV. So that was very Glorious Revolution, very important. Finally, your very good point, Blenheim Palace. Blenheim is part of his legacy, this beautiful, wonderful World Heritage Site that was completed by Sarah, and gives Sarah, Marlborough died in 1722, Sarah died 20 years later. Give her due, she hated the idea of Blenheim to start with. Blenheim was built by Vanbrugh as a tribute, a memorial to the glory of the age of Queen Anne. That's what Vanbrugh built this magnificent palace for, not as a private residence. But give Sarah her due, she hated the whole pomposity of it all. She hated Vanbragh's bridge, which is absolutely splendid, but she completed the whole thing after his death in 1740. And I have to tell you, having grown up there, that the atmosphere I found fine. I thought it was a happy atmosphere. Over the years, it had a lot of unhappiness attached to it, but not during my mother's generation. They were the last children really to be brought up there full time. But I never felt it was haunted. They always say it was the Dean Jones room, who was Winston's private chaplain. That room is where Winston was born. They always say that was haunted. He haunted the palace, but it had a wonderful atmosphere. And Sarah completed it all. Marlborough was very lucky. He had strokes in sort of 17, 18, 19 after his exile. He came back under George I. And Sarah managed to complete the east wing of the palace, which is the private quarters today, the private wing today, in 1719. And so he had 3 years of watching the workmen build the palace and moving into the palace, which was wonderful. But Sarah really turned it into a home after his death. It's a truly wonderful. I can say that it's not just a monument to the age of Queen Anne. It really is a home. Obviously, it's changed today, but it's become more institutionalized. But we have Sarah to thank for that.
And where did Churchill die, and where was he buried, and where is he now? Triple question to finish on.
Okay, well, Winston, I'm gonna finish with okay, Dan, this is really good. I'm so glad you brought it up. Dynasty, Blenheim and the dynasty. Well, of course, it's amazing that a family produced in 200 years 3 people of the quality of Winston Churchill, his father Randolph, who, remember, before the age of 40 was Chancellor of the Exchequer, leader of the House, and the first Duke. Now, Winston, very interesting, because Winston's idol was his great ancestor, John Churchill, first Duke of Marlborough. Blenheim was his spiritual home. And they had a lot in common. Winston wrote his greatest book, 2 volumes, The Life and Times of the First Duke of Marlborough. And he knew so much about the first Duke, and they had this in common. I won't say they were deserters, because that's a bit unkind, but they turned their backs on their patrons together. First of all, Marlborough, as we know, in the Glorious Revolution, for Sir James II, his patron, for William of Orange. Somebody said about him, "You're the first lieutenant general that's ever deserted your colours." But he did it because he had a conscience for the Protestant faith, but also had a self-interest. He knew which way the wind was blowing. And you have to do that in those days. You had to have your ear to the ground, your nose to the wind, and duck and weave, be a bit of a trimmer. So he deserted his king. And thank God for the country that he did. Winston did the same thing in 1904. He left the House, he left the Tories, he crossed the House to the Liberals. Again, he did it out of conscience, because his father, Lord Randolph's flag was Tory democracy. Winston he was a very liberal conservative, Winston. He wanted to lay the foundations of the welfare state. He cared about the welfare of his people. So he deserted his party in 1904. And neither of them were really forgiven. Winston was never forgiven until 1940 when he shelled the French fleet at Orléans, you know, great Francophile, shelled the French fleet to stop it getting into German hands. When he sat down in the House of Commons, the whole House roared its approval and flashed its order papers, and he sat down in tears. That was the first time he was really trusted since 1904. The same with Marlborough. William of Orange never really trusted him again. Even under George I, he was accused of being a Jacobite plots. Two things that I think Winston got from the first Duke. Firstly, intelligence services. Marlborough was brilliant. Intelligence was terribly important. He had a private secretary called Adam de Cardinal, okay? And he built an intelligence service under that. Very important before Blenheim. After he stormed the Schellenberg in July 1704, he had to take that to protect his lines of communication before the Battle of Blenheim. He heard from deserters that you know, the French had many more troops, well, not many, but quite a lot more troops than Marlborough did. But he heard from his intelligence services that the French horses had a fever, a disease. He heard that the logistics were poor, they weren't well supplied. So Marlborough went into battle with Prince Eugene, his great friend and equally talented general, with inferior numbers, but superior intelligence. Okay, so intelligence was important to Marlborough. Why was Bletchley Park so important to Winston and Alan Turing? I mean, for goodness sake, Bletchley Park breaking the German codes practically won us the war. There was that, okay, intelligence. And the second thing was the second front. Now, as I said, Marlborough moved his troops down from the stalemate in Flanders in Belgium in the summer of 1704 down to the Danube. Hell of a march, it really was. The logistics were incredible. Marlborough decided to open a second front down on the Danube. Winston and the Dardanelles decided Flanders, stalemate, trench warfare, let's do what my great ancestor did. We'll go for Gallipoli. And it damn nearly succeeded. So really an interesting analogies between Winston and his great ancestor. Winston is buried in Blaydon churchyard, along with Clemmy, which is a lovely little parish church. You can see it from the palace about a mile away. The first Duke, after Westminster, he was buried in Westminster Abbey. He was taken out and buried in the chapel at Blenheim with Sarah in the 1740s when Sarah died. It's rather nice that my grandparents didn't want to be buried in the vault at Blenheim because they found it a bit gloomy. I mean, it is going down, you know, to this great sepulchre. And so my granny and grandpa are buried in Blaydon churchyard up against a wall, looking north to their palace under a little cherry tree. And Winston's about 20 yards away. So that's really nice. They're all in Blaydon churchyard. My uncle Sonny, who died a few years ago, he decided to go into the vault at Blenheim. So that's where Sarah and the Duke are, the first Duke. Winston and my grandparents are up in the charming little parish church of Blaydon. So there we go. I think Blenheim is a wonderful place, and to me personally, it's done so much for me. It's given me so much in life. My interests are, you know, of heritage, of history, of art, the countryside, country sports, ornithology, conservation. All these things have come from Blenheim. And when I was a child there, it was much more feudal, okay? It's institutional today. They've got a brilliant management team. It's a huge business. When I was there was Mr. Cornell, the groom, in his brown overalls, Mr. Wadman, like the big butler, he was, you know, in Downton Abbey. Mr. Illingworth ran the pair, Bessie Bramall, the chauffeur that was always tipsy and rolling the Bentley. There's a really tight group of loyal public servants who, you know, I looked on as my idols and were really good friends. And my great friends were the gamekeepers. Mr. Poulter was the head keeper. And two of them taught me so much about birds. It's one of the great love of my life. I think it's a truly wonderful place, a great World Heritage site, and it's very good to see it today under such good management and in such good hands as the trustees had it. They have a terrific management team and it's a wonderful business. They're having a tough time at the moment, obviously, with COVID. But once they're through that, they'll be back into the broad sunlit uplands.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much, Michael. That was a wonderful tour de force around the life of the first Duke, who died today 299 years ago. Next year, Blenheim will be doing a whole wonderful series of activities and talks and things to mark the 300th anniversary. And I hope I will be a part of that as well. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, Blenheim.
Thank you, Dan. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.